All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Fournier, and I am the Director of Customer Success and Operations here at Checkpoint, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's webinar. So today's conversation is for behavioral healthcare practice owners who might be thinking about the future of their organization, whether it's an exit on the immediate horizon or maybe still several years away. Okay. So before I introduce Daniel, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So everyone will remain muted during the presentation just to help minimize background noise. Your cameras are enabled, so you are welcome to turn yours on if you would like. There will be a Q&A session after Daniel's presentation, so feel free to submit those questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the top of your screen. I'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and we will have a Q&A portion at the end. Okay. We're also recording today's webinar, so the recording will be available after the session as well. Okay. So now I am pleased to introduce you to today's presenter, Daniel King. So Daniel is the founder and in-house counsel at Fireside Strategic. His background includes mergers and acquisitions law, executive coaching, and organizational psychology, as well as private company investing. He spends much of his professional time working directly on practice acquisitions, giving him firsthand insight into both the financial and human side of these transactions. So today, Daniel will walk us through these decisions as practice owners and what they should consider when planning an exit, from the type of transaction and investor to the owner's future role and the steps that can help increase the value of that practice. So Daniel, thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. I'm going to share just a moment. Oh, what am I doing here? Stop sharing. Screen. Okay. Okay, everyone, welcome. Please feel free to jump in anytime. I mean, I am going to definitely take questions at the end, but if an absolutely burning question hits you, please feel free to just drop a note in the chat. We'll have a look for it, or feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind interruptions. I spent years in New York where I learned that interrupting is polite. So you're welcome to interrupt. I'm going to today be talking about exits for mental health practice owners. Very, very briefly, why you should listen to me when I talk about this stuff. This is all I do. So I am one of the co-founders of a firm called Fireside, which is a culture-focused investment firm, only in outpatient behavioral health. And our mandate is to buy only outpatient practices, usually a majority of them. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later, different ways to exit your company. And we do it through a culture lens, which means we aren't just financial investors, although we are. We definitely care about profitability. We have a long-term philosophy that when you invest in a practice, it will ultimately produce the best returns for investors if you care about the human aspect of these businesses. And believe you me, and I think you guys know this is a human business. So you don't take care of the humans, you've got nothing. So 80% of my time is doing that. And then 20% of my time is representing practices on the sell side. So in scenarios where Fireside is not the right fit investor, often practices will engage me to help them find a different investor. And like Katie mentioned, my background is in three worlds, which all sort of flow together with behavioral health acquisitions. I have a background in M&A law, in sort of organizational psychology, and investing in private companies. So let's get into the presentation today, how it's going to be structured. There's going to be four kind of main areas that I dive into, as well as a few little bonuses that come up, and anything else that sparks your interest. Anything in the realm of mental health M&A is fair game to ask. But the four kind of key areas that I'm going to dive into are number one, mindset. So what is the right mindset to be in when you're thinking about selling your practice in order to get the best possible exit? What type of transaction do you want to do? You know, there's a few different types that I'm going to be going into. Very high level, it's 100% deals where you're selling the entirety of your company. You could sell a majority of your company, or you could actually sell a minority of your practice. And then there's one other special kind of transaction that I'm going to go into as well. I want to next go into what kind of investor you want to work with, because there's different kinds of investors out there. Then let's talk a little bit about the role that you want post-transaction, because there's a bunch of different ways to skin the cat here. You can stay, you can leave, and there's a bunch of different things in between. And then we'll touch at the end on how to maximize your sale price. So let's start with mindset. Okay. So the three big things that you want to keep in mind about the emotional journey here, because selling a practice is very much an emotional journey. Number one, you want to really be able to take pride in what you built. If it's a big struggle to do that, you may not be ready to sell your practice. And the reason for that is that any professional investor is going to do due diligence on your practice. So if there are skeletons in the closet, if there's things that you're aware of that you're not thrilled about, an investor probably won't be thrilled about them either. And so the way to address this is to be honest and self-aware about the issues in the practice, and to really look to clean them up before you put the practice on the market. And that pride that you have in your practice is really going to shine through. And I know when I'm representing practices or when I'm buying them, I can feel that pride, or I can feel the absence of it. And it makes a huge difference in the smoothness, the likelihood of actually closing your transaction. Next is emotional turbulence. So even if you have a lot of pride in what you built, even if the skeletons in the closet have been dealt with, look, it's going to be an emotional journey. Things are going to happen. I look at the last 5 transactions I've worked on where we've experienced everything from an EHR transition to a payer suddenly deciding to reduce rates 60%, to key employees leaving. Anything and everything can happen. And the emotional impact of the things that happen, it's usually intense in mental health when you're running a group practice, and it gets even more intense when you are under the kind of scrutiny that an investor will put you under. So please appreciate, I want to be really upfront with people that it's an emotionally turbulent journey. You have to be ready for that. And you want to build a team around you that really knows what they're doing, really understands mergers and acquisitions. It's a specialized world, and they can help you understand when you should overreact and when you should. But understand it is going to be an emotional roller coaster, even if everything goes according to plan, which it won't. And then finally, ask yourself the question as to why you're doing this. This is the third mindset piece, because there's all kinds of different reasons to sell your practice. And the reality is, everyone's reason may be a little bit different, and your why is going to inform what kind of transaction you should seek. You may change your mind about what kind of investor you want to work with, or whether you want to sell 100% versus a majority or a minority. So the clearer you are about your why, the easier it's going to be, because while you can change your mind mid-process and it might work for you, it might also not work for you. So you want to be clear about the things that we're talking about before you go to market with your practice. Let's talk about transaction types next. So here are the 3 main ones. And what I want to start off with here is that most practice owners, when they think of selling their practice, they think of a 100% sale where they leave. And I so often see scenarios where a practice owner is burned out, they're really tired, they're done. They don't want to be doing this anymore. And that's a perfectly reasonable reason to want to sell your practice. And I invite you, if you take one thing away from this presentation, it's to think about mergers and acquisitions. It's to think about selling your practice as not just that scenario. There's plenty of other types of transactions, plenty of other reasons to want to sell your practice, and you don't need to sell 100% of it, okay? You're going to see fewer and fewer, I predict, of these 100% transactions in our universe. And there's a bunch of reasons for this, but many buyers really value a seller that has put in the time and effort to build the practice, and they don't want to lose them. And many buyers have gone through the experience of buying a practice, the seller leaves, and then they mess something up. So these are rarer and rarer. They absolutely still happen. But even in these instances, you're probably going to be asked to stick around for a little while because you have institutional knowledge that no buyer has. Right? 2 other scenarios. First, a majority transaction. So my firm Fireside, this is our typical structure. Here, you would want to look at this if you believe in your business, if you're ambitious, but you know that there's certain growth buttons that you can't push on your own. There's certain things that you want help with in your business. So in this instance, by selling a majority of your business, you mitigate your financial risk. So you're able to take the cash that an investor gives you in return for a majority of your business, and you're able to put most of that in your pocket. And that's usually going to be some multiple of what your practice produces in annual profit. And this investor, because they're now the majority owner, is going to look to help you. They're going to be super invested in the practice getting to the next level financially. Now, that could take many different forms, so you really want to align from a values perspective and a mission perspective with whoever's doing this. But if you guys are aligned and this investor can do things that you can't on your own, then it could be a massive win for everyone. So this looks like, for example, we might buy 75% of a business and leave the owner with 25%. And the owner typically in this structure is going to stay. They're going to continue to operate the business. But our aim together is to grow it so that that 25% becomes very valuable and you get the ability to sell it a second time. So our term, the businessy term for this is 2 bites at the apple, because you get a first bite when we buy a majority of the business, and then you get a second bite if we're able to work together as partners and succeed and grow it, okay? So there's definitely benefits and drawbacks. If you think that you can do the whole thing on your own, then there's no need to sell a majority to someone like us. But if you are ambitious, you believe the business can grow, but it needs the right partner, then this is something to look at. Now let's go even further down the line and let's talk about minority transactions, where here you're selling less than 50% of the economics. And understand that there are a whole bunch of probably non-institutional investors, individual investors who are really excited about behavioral health. They see that there's a mental health crisis all across the country and they want to help. They bring skill sets from corporate America, business skill sets you may not have. So for example, I just finished a transaction with an amazing practice, and this practice, is growing, but their marketing is terrible and they really wanted a CMO. So I found someone who is now not just the CMO of the business, but he's an investor. And if he hits certain metrics, he has the ability to acquire up to a third of the company. And what's amazing about that is he's not just a consultant, he's someone who is invested. And the potential financial outcome for him is really significant if he can succeed. And we were also able to structure this, which was really cool, in a way where the risk was mitigated for the practice owner, where the practice founder, where he doesn't actually earn the ability to buy anything until he completes a trial period and achieves certain metrics. So he started as a consultant, and then by hitting metrics, he earns the right to invest and acquire more of the practice. So the minority transaction is a fit if you're really confident in the future of your business and you want one very specific skill set that the business is going to need that you don't have, and you want world-class talent to really hit it out of the park. I believe that mental health practice owners or group practice owners are wonderful people. They're usually really, really savvy clinically. They're visionaries, but they often don't have, certain fundamental business skill sets that can really help. And so that transaction I just described to you is an awesome opportunity to create a clinician, non-clinician partnership, which I'm a huge believer in. And then I have one little asterisk here. This is one other type of transaction, which is the multiple practice transaction, where let's say you want to sell, maybe your practice is relatively small, and we'll get into sort of what size you may want to be before you can seriously consider selling. But what you may be able to do, even if you really want to sell and your practice is on the small side, you may be able to work with another practice. And if you happen to know in your state another practice that wants to sell, it may be possible for me to package your practices together and sell to a buyer. And even if your practice is large enough to sell, packaging together with another practice, just less complicated than you might think, that could provide a better sale price for everyone, because buyers, investors, are looking for your profitability. And if you're together bringing more profitability to the table, you can charge a higher price. So something to keep in mind. Let's briefly go through the types of investors, and then I'll give you one or two other thoughts before we wrap. So these are the three main types. Think of them as like a spectrum, where on the far left, you get the most user-friendly type of investor. On the far right, you get the most capitalized, the investor with the most money, but also probably the least user-friendly. So this is like a spectrum, okay? And I want you to think about all of these different types of investors, what you might want, but also appreciate that generally the further you are to the left, the more likely, or the smaller your practice, I should say, the more likely you're a fit for an investor that's towards the left side of this spectrum. So individual investors are sometimes it's one individual or maybe a few individuals, and they're looking for practices that probably aren't the largest, but they're very human, and many of them are super mission driven, and many of them are great buyers who it's really easy to underestimate. There's more and more of these individuals out there, and of course, do your due diligence. But many of them do have the ability through SBA loans to buy practices, even if they're not wealthy. And many of them have phenomenal skill sets that could be super helpful for a behavioral health practice. In the middle here are professional investors, and I would put our firm in this category, where sometimes they're very specialized. We have the ability to pick and choose capital providers. So we work with different investors for different types of transactions for different practices. So this category really runs the gamut. Typically, you'll see these folks are a bit more flexible on their thesis than those institutional investors on the far right. These are the largest buyers who usually want the largest practices. And there are exceptions to that, but typically these are the most aggressive folks to deal with. And they may be less likely to be user-friendly than the others on this list. Let's next go to the role that you want. So M&A, like I said, is this opportunity to rethink a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily mean selling 100% and leaving. So you really want to ask yourself, what role do you want after a transaction? Do you want to leave completely? Do you want to stay? And if you stay, there's an opportunity to rethink what your role is. You could offload aspects of your role that you don't love to a partner. And if it's the right partner, they'll hopefully be able to do those aspects more effectively than you could. And for folks that are burned out but still see potential in their company, still want to continue in some capacity, maybe since burnout is so linked with misalignment, if you have a role that's better aligned, maybe you don't want to sell 100%. So really think about that as an opportunity. M&A is an opportunity to rethink your job as well as the future of the practice. Let's briefly touch on maximizing your sale price. This could be a whole presentation on its own, but 3 big things that I see with a lot of practice owners are: number one, we want to increase profitability. Most investors are going to look at that first and foremost. A typical threshold to shoot for to get started, especially with those individual investors on that, remember that left side of the spectrum here, would be to be earning at least $400K after you've paid yourself a market salary. And even this is a minority of mental health group practice owners. So you want to try to aim for that 400 of profit marker. At that point, it is definitely going to be easier, especially if you're not packaged with another practice. It's going to be easier to find someone to buy your practice. Next is payer concentration. So most investors will, if your practice is generating the vast majority of its revenue from just one insurance company, that's going to be a problem for them, right? Because they're concerned about changes that insurance company might make. And so you want to here look at creating new revenue streams. You want to look at adding new payers, even a payer that pays you less than you would like could give you the benefit of diversification, which we certainly want and most investment firms will want. And then third, culture. This is a people business. So smart investors appreciate, like I've said, that they need the people. Collect data on what your clinicians want if you're losing too many. There's always a balance in group practices between paying clinicians what they want. You can't always pay them what they want. Not so much that your margins are destroyed, but enough that you can keep them. And we're a huge advocate here of getting creative, really serving your clinicians, treating them like customers in a sense, to understand what they view as most important, what they think is missing, because every group practice is a community and people need to continually buy in to that community. Finally here, I think this is my last slide. If you're ever thinking about selling, a big question to think about is whether to hire an intermediary. So this is like an advisor or representative, not your lawyer, but an M&A advisor who handles a lot of the business aspects of the transaction, because it's a bit like hiring a real estate agent if you're selling a house. So this is what I spend 20% of my time doing when I'm not buying. I am an intermediary. I represent sellers, which means, there are various listings, just like there are for houses, where I put your business up for sale. I also call a whole bunch of different connections of mine, people who buy, people who invest. And I also think about new people in my network who I may not know so well, who could be a fit. And I'm out there with the phone, pounding the pavement, looking for the right buyer or investor for you. So just like with a house, you could sell it on your own, or you could work through an agent. Although typically it's going to be harder to sell your business without an agent, probably, than a house, because there's a lot of specialized work that goes into knowing who the right buyer is, diligencing them, negotiating the terms, holding them accountable through the sale process, making sure that they don't screw you. Okay, so that's some of the work of an intermediary. But there are definitely cons to working with an intermediary. So this is like a relatively straightforward list of the pros and cons. And if you hire an intermediary, they can handle these negotiations, but you do lose some control. They'll also handle a lot of that emotional burden. Like I said, this is an emotional roller coaster, M&A, but you have less connection to your buyer that way. And a bad intermediary is going to damage the relationship between you and the investor. You also don't have to learn all of this stuff about M&A, which it's complicated. I've been working in some variety of M&A probably for 8 or 10 years at this point, and it's complicated, and I still have a lot to learn. So most business owners are only doing one transaction. Most practice owners are only going to do one transaction. I've done many. And there's still much to learn for me. So definitely there's an advantage that you don't need to learn all this stuff, but you may want to. You may find it interesting. And then fourth and fifth, these are really important to know. I can probably, with my network, find more investors faster than you can. But the downside is you have to pay me a commission. We can get into how all that works later in the Q&A if you want. If you find an investor without me, you don't owe me a commission, but you have to do all this other work that I could potentially do for you. So those are the pros and the cons. With that, here is my contact info. So feel free to drop me an email. Feel free to give me a call. You can pull me up on LinkedIn here. I'm creating all kinds of content. I have a podcast that I'm relaunching on soon on mental health M&A. You can look up the old podcast at Your Group Practice on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, if you want to learn about growing mental health practices and mergers and acquisitions in our world. So thank you, Checkpoint, for the presentation. Thanks for coming, and I am here to talk to you about any aspect of this.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so I think you covered, something that is especially important for practice owners, that there isn't one universally best exit. So we'll move on to our Q&A now. So again, reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in that Q&A section at the top of your screen. And I'll be keeping an eye on that. Yeah, so while everyone takes a moment to submit their questions, I'll start us off with one. So you talked about the importance of being clear about your why before beginning the acquisition process. What are some signs that an owner is genuinely ready to start exploring versus simply, feeling burned out or overwhelmed by the current demands of running their practice?
Yeah. What are some internal signs, or sort of extra, like in the business owner's soul, or in the how the business is doing generally?
Either one.
Either one.
Yeah.
So I think the first big thing I'll point you to is pride in your business. Do you feel genuinely, if you're honest with yourself, do you feel that sense of contentment and accomplishment in what you built? Because that emotion is contagious. Buyers will feel it. If you can confidently stand up and say, I built something awesome, I'm ready for the next phase of my life, whatever it looks like, whether it's leaving completely, bringing on a partner, whatever it is, I feel content with what I've achieved and I am definitively ready. I can feel certainty that it's time for the next step. If you can get to that level of certainty and confidence, it's a beautiful thing. And I know as a more sensitive investor, I will feel that confidence and it will bode very well for you.
Awesome. If an owner thinks an exit may still be, say, like 3 to 5 years away. What are one of the first or like one or two things that you would recommend they begin working on now?
Yeah. Profitability is a huge thing for most practices. So most practices are not at that minimum 400,000 of profitability marker where they can start to access more and more credible investors. And so getting to that profitability threshold is probably priority number one. All that said, I'm a big fan of systems building. So most practice owners are also probably doing too much in their practice. They're uncomfortable delegating. They haven't hired people to do some of the tasks that they're probably not best suited to do. They haven't offloaded those tasks. And so once you're profitable enough, there's a level of confidence you need. And it took me some time to really learn how to do this. There's a level of confidence you need to spend the money to get the right help. And even if that temporarily diminishes your profitability, it's going to make your business way more attractive to investors. It will probably de-stress your life. Not always the easiest thing to find good people, but if you have systems in place that give an investor confidence, it's going to be easier for you to show up with that pride and contentment in what you built. And it's much easier, especially if it's an individual investor who's coming into the practice. Now it's not messy, it's clean, everything is ordered. It's going to make the investor's life so much easier, and they're probably going to want to pay you more for your business.
Great advice. What deal terms do you think deserves more attention than owners maybe typically give them?
So I was speaking with a practice owner in Colorado last week who I really like, and I was giving her my view on what was realistic for her sale. So she's above that 400,000 threshold, not by too much. And she had this idea in her head that she was going to get entirely cash, that a buyer was going to come along and pay her a multiple that was entirely going to be cash. We think about selling a business, that's an idea a lot of us have in our heads. Most professional investors are not going to give you entirely cash. Okay, they're going to value your business. So let's say you're producing 500,000 of profit, and let's say they're going to value your business at 4 times that profit. Okay, it might be more than that. I'm just giving you an example. So now your business is worth $2 million. Most investors are not going to give you $2 million in cash for 100% of your business. Why not? Well, first of all, you don't have a ton of leverage as a business that has 500,000 of profit. There's other bigger companies out there that investors want more. And as a result of not having all that leverage, investors are going to have some choices. And most investors are going to want to share some of the risk with you. If they give you 100% of the cash and you leave, now they're bearing all the risk. They're the ones running the business. You're gone. You're vacationing in the Caribbean, and they can't bother you. Are most investors going to do that? No, right? They're going to want to mitigate their risk. They're going to want you to share. They're going to want you to have some skin in the game, some opportunity to be affected by the outcome. So if it's not so positive, they want you to bear some of that risk. And there's a few different ways they do that. What I told this practice owner was, you're not going to be able to get most likely 100% of your value in cash. An investor is going to be concerned about some of your clinicians leaving. And as a result, they could have some of that purchase price contingent on clinicians staying for a year. So sometimes, and some of the larger, we don't do this, but some of the larger investors will say, for each clinician that leaves of your 30 clinicians, you're going to lose X number of dollars off of your purchase price. That's one thing they could do. They could also reward you more positively. So they could say, they're going to give you a bonus if you continue to operate the business, or if you're playing some role in it going forward. At certain profitability thresholds, you will get paid more. So if you turn that business from 500 to 750 to $1 million, you're going to be earning more. Another term is called a seller note. Okay, so part of that 2 million, let's say it's 10% of that 2 million. Okay, that's 200,000. That 200,000 is not paid up front to you in cash. Instead, it is debt. It is debt that the investor owes you, usually over, let's say, 5-ish years. And there's going to be an interest rate attached to that debt. So every quarter, every half year, the investor is going to, it's not going to be 10% interest, but let's say it is 10% interest with no principal repayment. So what that's going to mean is $20,000 each year that investor is paying you. The principal, so that's the interest, the principal on your note will be paid at the end of 5 years. Now, investors like this because it means they have to spend less cash up front. You may not like it so much at first because you're not getting all of your money up front. It's an incentive for investors to keep you more involved, right? Because if the ship goes down, you may not be paid that money. There's a hierarchy where people are paid. And that's a whole other thing we can get into. But earnouts, seller notes, bonuses, contingent payments, those are all important terms to know about.
Okay, awesome. What is one red flag that should cause an owner to maybe slow down or reconsider a potential transaction?
So there's so many. A big one that I saw recently was a very large practice with 80 clinicians. Their marketing was starting to fail. So years ago when the pandemic hit, it was pretty easy for them to get customers. Now it isn't. So their marketing costs are going up and up. They've probably gone up like 200% over the course of 2 to 3 years. And it's much harder for them to bring in clients. At the same time, some of their other costs, their employee costs are going up, and they probably overpay their clinicians. So a business that seemed to be at, we thought, 2-ish million of profit is probably below 800,000 of profit. So those owners are just not going to get, unfortunately, the kind of price that they wanted. And so if your profitability is declining, if your costs are out of control, that's usually not the best time to be selling.
Mhm.
I would say another big thing is if clinicians depart. Sometimes there's an exodus where a whole bunch of clinicians, for whatever reason, decide to leave. And if it's a pure therapy practice, that is going to freak out investors. So those are two big things that investors will cause them to either that they might reduce the price, right? And if all this happens in the middle of a transaction, or they might walk away completely.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about if you flip-flop it? So like what red flags do owners maybe get from like investors where they should like, whoa, wait a minute, I don't know about this.
Yeah. I always say date before you get married. So one of these transactions these transactions are huge moments in your life, and you don't want to rush into them. If I put on my sell side hat for a moment, if I'm representing an owner, I really want to understand who these investors are as people. So do I get good vibes, first of all? I think you want to use your intuition, but then also gather data. Have these people screwed over others before? There's a wide variety of different types of investors, like I said, and even amongst those three categories I shared, people have different senses of ethics. So some investors will, they'll sign documents with you for X purchase price, and then maybe 5 days before closing the transaction, with no justification, they'll reduce the price on you. Now you've been through weeks and weeks of this arduous process, supplying all these documents, doing all this due diligence work for them. And then at the last second, with no justification, they tell you, oh, we're going to give you 2 million less than we said we would. Well, there are legitimate reasons for investors to reduce purchase price if the business starts suffering significantly in profitability, but then there are illegitimate reasons to do it. And I would diligence investors and find out if they have a track record of doing that, because it happens more often than you might think. You don't want to hand your practice over to people that aren't good people. So I would say do your due diligence just as if you were hiring someone. So if I'm hiring someone to do a job, experience is one thing to look for. And sometimes the best people don't have a ton of experience, but the best people never have massive ethical black marks consistently on their reputation, right? So experience is one thing, but even more important than that is character. And I would make unsolicited reference calls, find people that know the people that run the firm, and find out if they've done shit like that. Because as a seller's representative, I'm not going to allow anyone like that to go down the journey of buying a practice I represent. I'm going to find out who they are. And if they have a history of screwing people, they're not going to screw my people.
Okay, awesome. Let's see. It looks like we have one last question here. What do you say to owners who may feel rushed to sell because of stress in their business? And if it seems really that it's not the right time from your view?
So yeah, I sit on both sides of the table, right, as a
Mm.
buyer and a seller. And so the advice I might give is going to be a little biased in either direction, but I try, even as a buyer, to give as unbiased, advice as I can. And I'll say that a lot of owners will, like, burnout is the most common story. If I were to think about the 110 practice owners I've spoken with over 4 years of doing this, the most common story is burnout. And every burnout story is a little different. So in some cases, it's recoverable. In some cases, with just the right support, someone could avoid making what would otherwise be a pretty bad business and financial decision by soldiering on a little bit longer, hopefully in a less stressful way. But in other cases, it's just so clear that they want out. They're so crystal clear about it. They don't want anything else to get in the way of that. And at a human level, they have to do what they have to do. So burnout being the most obvious story, I think it's important to diligence your own level of burnout. And if you need to sell this to take care of yourself, that's what you've got to do. I'm not going to judge you. But what I can do is probably give you a feel for the financial implications of that decision and help you understand whether your burnout is so bad that you want to pay that price or not. Now, there's other reasons to sell, of course, beyond burnout. And in those instances, there's so many other factors at play. It's complicated. There's market dynamics, whether the market is likely to get better for you. There's what payers are going to do. There was a transaction we were working on relatively recently where 70% of the revenue came from one payer. And we did a lot of diligence and we actually got comfortable with that payer, but we were wrong because I found out about a month ago that this payer massively reduced its rates, like massively. It's a very unique payer. I won't go into which one it is. And so we would have been in real trouble had we actually closed that transaction. So you cannot predict the future, but seek out advice from a wide variety of people, do your own research, and just make the best possible decision you can because no one knows the future for sure. But at least you can arm yourself with the human, financial, and other, pieces of information out there to make the best possible decision you can make.
Mhm. Okay, great. All right, well, that was the last question that we had. So, Dan, thank you again for joining us and sharing all of your expertise. Definitely gave everyone a lot to consider. Yeah, and we thank we thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope, this gave you a clear understanding of the questions to begin asking when considering selling your practice in the future. Again, we will make this recording available following the webinar. But yeah, thank you again, Dan, and thank you everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.